Welcome to another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are archived. You can find them at artistfirst.com. And now, from England, here she is, your host, Deborah Ruffini.
Greetings from England. It's Deborah Ruffini with another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show. Today it is my pleasure to be speaking with the amazing Nancey Little on the subject of what signs to look for in a child who is being abused. It is always an honour to speak with the insightful Nancey, who is such a blessing. How are you doing, Nancey?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Oh, that's good. Thank you so much for being on the show again. It's always, I always feel whenever we speak, it's like my eyes have been opened. You're a very good teacher and mindful of knowledge, and
thank you.
You know, give us things to think about that we'd never really thought about before or considered. And this is a very interesting subject, very important subject, and of course something that's very close to your heart, isn't it?
Yes.
And from the outside looking in, you know, we could notice and detect things so much clearer, can't we, when something's put behind us, and you know, we've been there. And it may be a difficult thing to answer, but something that hit me yesterday as I knew I was going to be speaking to you. When did you know that you were a victim of abuse? Was it? Did you have an awareness at the time that something wasn't quite right, or was it over time that you counselling?
I didn't have parents that taught me names of my private parts. I didn't have parents who talked to me about sex or what was normal, what wasn't normal.
Yeah.
So we weren't taught about, you know, there was no teaching in the schools when I grew up about any kind of abuse, whether physical, sexual. That just wasn't something that was talked about then.
Mm.
But when I was 6 and then 5 or 6 and I was in first grade, we were sitting in reading group one day, and the little girl next to me, a friend of mine, had asked me to come spend the night on a Saturday night, which, you know, most little kids, you know, like to have sleepovers. That's pretty normal.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, no, I can't do that. And she said, why not? And I said, well, my mother has to do, and I went on to describe something that my mother did every Saturday night, and she just reacted in horror, and she pulled back, and she said, oh, no, my mother would never do that to me.
Crumbs.
And so it's at that point that I at least had an understanding what was going on at home. Was it normal?
Yeah.
I still didn't have the words for it, and didn't have the words for it for many years, because my mother did not teach us the proper names for our private parts. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I was well into, 14, 15 years old before I realized what the names were, and I only learned that through health class.
Yeah.
Because we had health class in junior high school, which is now called middle school, but we weren't taught about sex then. It was more about drugs and things like that. It wasn't until I was a sophomore in high school that we learned, what the names were, how people had sex, all that kind of stuff. So I was a late bloomer as far as understanding, just my body,
yeah,
the names of my body parts, and that was one reason that I did, want to talk about the subject, because the basis for, just basic teaching for our children, parents have to do their job. This shouldn't be up to the teachers in the classes. We need to teach our children the name of their body parts, not just nicknames. How's the child going to be able to tell somebody that somebody is hurting them sexually if they don't even know what their own body parts are called?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And so it's important for a little girl to know she has a vagina, she has a vulva, a boy has a penis, How are they going to be able to tell somebody that, hey, Uncle so-and-so or Granddaddy so-and-so is touching me if they don't even know what their own body parts are called?
Yeah.
And so that needs to start as young as toddlers. We teach our children their ears, their eyes are their eyes, their fingers are their fingers, but for some reason we want to shy away and we don't want to talk to our children that they have names for their private parts. That teaches a child immediately that there's something that needs to be shameful about that there's something wrong with their body parts.
Yeah, that's
so
true, isn't it? Yeah.
Parents need to be teaching their children, early. When my daughter went in for her 20-month checkup, and she's 35, the first thing she told the doctor was, "That's my vagina, and you not touch it." And he kind of laughed, and he said, "Well, I'm glad to see that she knows what her body parts are."
Oh.
And then I told her, a doctor's here, it's okay. But she was learning what the names of her body parts were.
Yeah.
Because I wanted her to know if something ever happened to her, she needed to be able to tell me, hey, this is going on. So that's the preliminary to kind of what I wanted to talk about. I've had a lot of people ask me, with the 2 previous interviews that I've done with you, I'm a teacher, I'm a therapist, I'm a relative. What do I look for in a child that I think might be abused?
Oh.
And so those, that's kind of what I wanted to touch on today. After as parents we teach these things to our children, then as aunts and uncles and teachers, Sunday school teachers, teachers at school, what do we need to be looking for in a child? And while there might not, some of the things that we're going to talk about today, one in particular may not mean a child is being abused. If a child starts showing 4, 5, or 6 of these signs, then, it's a pretty good,
indicator
percentage that this child is being abused in some way.
Yeah. Oh, this is very important to get this out there, isn't it?
I think it's extremely important. I've written down some notes just so that, there's so many of them. I wanted to try to be able to stay on point. But
yeah,
I've heard from many teachers who have asked me, well, what do I need to be looking for? What, I've got a child who's portraying this behavior. Could this possibly mean she's being abused? And so I think this is something that we need to talk about.
Yeah.
Because the only way we're going to stop child abuse is for adults like us to stop standing by and waiting for somebody else to do something.
Very good.
We've got to take charge, and we've got to be the voice of a child, because most children do not just walk up to an adult and say, Uncle so-and-so is sexually abusing me. That's not how children tell. Children tell through their behavior most of the time. So it's got to be up to us as adults to recognize if we're seeing some negative behaviors, what are those, so that we can take action from that point on.
Yeah, very good. That's a good observation, actually. You wouldn't get a child saying those words. Those are words that an adult would recognise for this thing.
Exactly. But children often tell through their behavior. So I wanted to touch on some of those so that maybe, somebody out there who's seeing 4 or 5 or 6 of these signs can recognize, hey, something may not be, something's not right here.
Yeah.
We need to call CPS, who was the agency in the United States. I'm not sure, who the agency is there, but in the U.S. they would call the 1-800-CPS line, where you can make a complaint anonymously. You don't even have to leave your name or phone number. So you can make a complaint and say, hey, this is something that I'm seeing. Can somebody please look into it?
Yeah. No, that's good.
Because I would rather somebody make a complaint that is unfounded than a child who is being abused and everybody just looks the other way.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's good. So what are some of those signs? This is a learning curve for me because I don't know what so this I'm going to be learning a lot by this. What are some of the
Well,
more
some of
obvious signs?
the signs I've written down is one of the first ones is children. And let me back up. I'm kind of speaking to teachers, whether it's a Sunday school teacher, whether it's a teacher at school. Those are where most of our kids are going to be during the day.
Yeah.
Daycares, an elementary school, middle school, even high school. So I'm kind of going to speak to teachers because that's who I've heard the most from, but this is for any adult who might see some of these signs. But one of the big ones is children that don't play with others.
Oh.
Or if they do play in groups, what does that play look like? For example, my sister's teachers, when she was in 3rd or 4th grade, wrote to my parents on a report card that said she's a loner and she refuses to play with others.
Oh.
Well, that was a big sign. It should have been a big sign. I played in groups in elementary school. However, if the teachers had been paying attention to what I was playing, I was always the kid that had to be in some kind of dungeon or jail and had to be rescued by somebody.
That's interesting.
So had the teachers been paying attention, they would have realized that, hey, there's something that's not quite right, because all of her theme play is always her being in some kind of jail or situation where she's being held captive.
Wow.
So it should have been a big sign had the teachers been paying attention. Children that hide from others. When my parents' friends came over or relatives came to the house, I was the kid that would hide behind the china cabinet or under a bush outside.
Right.
I was afraid of new people or people that I hadn't seen very often. At school, I would hide under the school steps instead of out playing with the other kids. Children that are being bullied constantly. I was pushed down at school. I had children trying to take my clothes off at school.
Oh.
I wore clothes that didn't fit well. They were hand-me-downs. They weren't even in the style that was even popular back then. My mother knew that I was being teased and really didn't care about that situation. She would put me in clothes that she knew that other kids would find odd. And so she knew that she was putting me in a situation where I was going to be teased or going to be bullied about it. And that didn't seem to matter to her.
Can I ask why she would do that, Nancey?
My mother had multiple mental issues, and so, part of it is she just enjoyed us being the oddball out, and part of it was just her sadistic way of knowing that I was uncomfortable. And then she would use my juvenile rheumatoid arthritis as an example. Well, see, you've got that, so that's why they want to tease you. And so she used that against me and made that like if you didn't have that, then everybody would like you. So, there was a combination of part of it she was just being mean, and part of it was her sadistic side coming out.
That's horrific.
When I was in 2nd grade, I had some kids at school that began throwing rocks at me, and they hit me in the head.
Oof,
and I had this huge gash in my head, and it took all day for my teacher to finally get my mother to come pick me up. For days, and for about 2 weeks after, every morning my teacher had to take a warm washcloth and get my bangs out of the dried blood in my head. And my teacher kept asking me, why didn't your parents take you to get your head stitched up? Well, I was 7 years old. I didn't know what to tell her. My parents didn't take us to the doctor.
No.
I knew that I would be in trouble if I told them that my parents wouldn't take me to the doctor, so all I could do was just look at my feet, tears streaming down my face, hoping that a hole would just swallow me up.
Yeah. Oh, Lord, yes.
So that should have been a sign that, hey, this child is not getting the care that she needs at home. Even without knowing about the sexual abuse, wouldn't that have been a sign to a teacher that, hey, she's not being cared for because I'm having to take care of this every morning before class?
Yeah.
When I was 15, I broke my hip. It took my parents almost 3 days to finally take me to a hospital.
Oh, my goodness.
By that point, it was so twisted, they had to put me into traction at a trauma hospital in Dallas. They had to move me to a trauma hospital. It took them 3 days to finally straighten out my hip in traction before they could operate it and pin it all back together.
Oh.
A nurse came in and asked me, why did it take your parents so long to have it treated? But she dropped the ball. She never pursued that. I couldn't tell them, hey, my parents don't want to take me to the hospital.
No.
I just kind of looked away and mumbled something like, you'd have to ask them. She never followed up with it. Never called CPS, never called any other agency. So again, another person just dropped the ball, and that's a nurse.
Yeah.
A nurse should have recognized, hey, this is not normal.
Yeah.
A child comes in, can't walk, her hip's broken completely in two, and it's taken the parents 3 days to get him in here. I mean, that's a huge red flag right there.
Yeah. Do you think there wasn't go back to, the nursing staff and teachers, do you think there wasn't the education back then of the signs, or do you think a lot of it was just...
Part of it was, again, it was in a different era, that's true, but even by the time I was 10 years old, CPS by that point was an agency that they could have called.
Yeah.
Certainly by the time I was 15, it was in full effect.
Yeah.
Yes, it's sad that before 1968 in the U.S., the only place to get help for children who were being abused was to call the Humane Society for Animals.
No!
Yes, so we had an agency to take care of people who were beating pets, but not children.
Crikey!
Yes.
That's horrific.
Just blows my mind. But, now we are starting to, teach about abuse, and partly that we are teaching it at school is a good thing. Kids need to know that they can come tell somebody, but most kids who are being abused still aren't going to walk up and just tell a teacher. It's going to take teachers knowing what to look for to be able to get that child some help.
Yeah.
Some of the other clues, that I've written down, children that come to school with clothes that don't fit the weather, or that they just seem to be unhealthy. I mean, I was 15 and weighed 50 pounds. That should have been a huge flag to anybody that saw me that something isn't quite right.
Yeah.
Most when I was first started therapy here, my therapist wanted me to bring some pictures in, as a child, so she could kind of, see what I looked like, and she was just astounded. She said I looked anorexic because I was just so thin.
Yeah.
And, I mean, how many teachers did I go through who saw me in class and never said a word that, hey, she's wearing clothes that don't fit well, she's very skinny, thin for her age, that should have been just a flag that something isn't quite right at home.
Yeah.
And again, while one of these in itself doesn't mean a child is being abused, if you have a child who's consistently showing multiple signs of concern, that's when an adult needs to speak up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's clear to see.
Children that fall asleep in class, I was constantly falling asleep in class.
Right.
And instead of just the teacher talking to me and asking, why was I sleeping in class, they would call my mother, who, of course, was my abuser, and would tell her that, hey, Nancy fell asleep in class again today, and I would get into more trouble at home. So it was just a constant cycle for me. Nobody asked, why was I falling asleep? Well, I was falling asleep because my mother would come into my room at night, and I would wake up with her hand down my pajama bottoms or down my underwear.
Lord.
So I would stay awake at night, thinking if I could just stay awake, somehow I would be able to stop it.
Yeah.
Like if I could be prepared, I learned to sleep on my stomach, which made it harder for her to get to me. But when you're constantly worried about someone coming into your room and bothering you at night, you're not going to get a good night's sleep.
No. Oh, crumbs, no.
So it was just one of these, again, a constant cycle, trying to stay awake to protect myself, and then I would be falling asleep at class because I was so tired from staying awake at night.
Yeah. And that was never picked up on?
Never picked up on, nope. I learned as I got older how to not fall asleep in class, but when you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that's a little bit harder to do.
Yeah. Yeah,
by the time I got to class, I would start getting sleepy in class, especially when things got quiet or we're supposed to be working on tests, and I would just fall asleep at my desk.
Yeah. And it also must have been difficult to, to have to sort of go through. You need to keep awake at night because of this horrible thing that's happening, and then you've got to stay awake at school. I guess it must have. I mean, did it affect sort of like learning or anything that you've got to take things in?
It did, because you're constantly worried. Once you learn, if it happens once or twice, then you learn you're going to be in trouble at home. So you're constantly trying to be alert to stay awake at class, but yet you got to stay awake at night. So your mother's not bothering you. It's a constant state of anxiety.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
You know you're going to be in trouble at school, and you know you're going to get hurt at home. So how does that meet for a child?
Yeah.
There was no easy answer other than just trying to stay awake at home, at school. But when you're 5, 6, 7, that's harder to do. As you get older, you learn how to cope with that a little bit better.
Crumbs, it's amazing how you came through all this.
It is, but, that's a lot where my faith comes in, that just,
that's good.
That's what I had to hold on to. That's the only thing I could hold on to for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good that you had that, because that was I guess that was the backbone, isn't it, to everything?
Yeah, it was. One of the big ones, especially, I think, for a lot of kids, is children that suck their thumb, suck on their fingers, twist their hair constantly. That is a sign of severe anxiety. Now, young children like to suck on their fingers, like to suck on their thumb. That in itself doesn't necessarily mean they're being abused. However, I would explain to people who ask that I even had a name for it. I called it my best friend thumb.
Oh.
My friend thumb, that's what I called it.
Yeah.
My mother tried everything she could to stop it. It infuriated both of my parents to no end. My mother would put cayenne pepper on my thumb. When that didn't work, she went down to the pharmacy and bought some kind of clear thing that you could, kind of like a paste that you could paint on it. And the paste was supposed to stop a kid from sucking their thumb. When that didn't work, she tried tying my hands behind my back. She tried embarrassing me in front of my friends and making fun at me. Well, Nancy sucks her thumb. What do you think about that? Isn't she such a baby? None of those things stopped me from sucking my thumb. My thumb, I knew that I had one friend at all times, and that was my thumb. I talked to it just like I'm talking to you, just like you're my best friend, because I knew no matter what they took away from me, I still had my thumb.
Yeah.
And children who feel out of control at ages 3, 4, 7, 8, 10, and are still sucking their thumb or curling or messing with their hair. I knew one child in my preschool who literally had no hair on one side because she had twisted her hair so much that she had lost her hair.
Oh, wow.
And so that, a child who does that necessarily doesn't mean they're being abused, but it certainly is something, when you get a child who's 8, 10, or 12 who's still doing that, that should be a red flag that maybe something isn't quite right.
Yeah.
Because it didn't matter what my parents did. No matter the embarrassment, no matter the punishment, it did not stop me from sucking my thumb, because it was the only thing that gave me some comfort and helped calm the anxiety that I constantly felt inside of me.
Yeah.
And I may not have friends at school, I may not have friends at home in our neighborhood, but my friend Thumb went with me everywhere I went. And so for me, for many, many years, that was my friend. That was the only friend I have. When we moved nonstop from place to place, and you never have a chance to make a friend, well, why would I lose my friend Thumb? Because that was my only friend for a long time.
Yeah. That makes sense. That does make sense.
One of the biggies that I've had a lot of teachers come and talk to me about is masturbation.
Okay.
While it's certainly common for young children to become curious, especially as they enter, the school year, and if a child begins masturbating just about anywhere, anytime, there's a high possibility a child may be sexually abused.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is a curiosity for many at 3, 4 when they first discover, that, hey, that feels good if I touch myself down there. But most children who are just curious, you can teach, hey, this is something you do in private, in your bedroom with the door closed. This is not something that you do just anywhere. And for me, it was a calming effect when I felt out of control or anxious.
Yeah.
I was never a quote-unquote behavior problem, a child that was sent to the principal's office. But when the kids at school picked on me or were bullying me, or I felt anxious or scared at school, I tried to be discreet, but it certainly didn't stop me because it was the only thing that calmed me down.
Yeah.
And it became such a big deal when I was in 4th grade or about 10 years old that my teacher told my mother she had to take me to a doctor to see if there was some kind of problem. So at least somebody recognized finally that, hey, this is not normal.
Yeah.
But back in 1969, when I was about 10, the doctor didn't even talk to me or ask me if there was a problem. He just looked at me and said, she's a normal, healthy 10-year-old girl, and sent me home. That was it. Nobody asked me, talked to me, asked me any questions, nothing.
Yeah.
So if you have a child who is doing this anywhere at a daycare or at school, doesn't seem to care that he or she is getting caught, that's a child who's trying to calm themselves down. That's a child who isn't thinking, hey, this isn't appropriate to do right now. They're just trying to find a way to calm that anxiety. There's probably a good possibility that child may be abused, being abused at that point.
Yeah.
A child who acts out sexually or on another child, a child who has been abused, some of them will then turn to younger children and do the same thing that had happened to them.
Oh.
So if you've got a 10 or 12-year-old child who's abusing a 3 or 4-year-old child, it's very well possible that this child was and is being abused by an older person.
Yeah, because where do they know how to do that?
Just acting out what had been done to them.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot when, like, an 8, 9-year-old child has been abused by an older sibling or a babysitter, then that child acts out on the younger siblings. So it's not just enough to say, hey, my 3-year-old had been abused by an older sibling. You need to delve into why is that sibling abusing the younger child.
Yeah.
Because that child learned it from somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
10-year-old kids just don't wake up one day and start abusing 3-year-old little boys or girls. They learned it from somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not something you imagine. It's something that you've got from somewhere else, isn't it?
Right.
This is making sorry. Yeah.
This can happen at school. It can happen at home. That's why teachers need to be, acutely aware where their kids are at all times.
Yeah.
And not just assume they're on the playground somewhere playing. Because it only takes a couple of minutes to abuse a child. It doesn't take that long.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Do you know, it's interesting. That's what you've just said there. Something's come into my head that I hadn't thought about for a long time, probably not since it happened. Junior school, it would have been the last year, so we probably would have been about 11. And we had this boy in our class, can't name names, but he suddenly was very... almost overnight became very sexual in his talk, and he talking about raping girls and speaking crudely to girls, and he came in and he had these photos, and I'd never seen a picture of a naked male before, but he said his babysitter at the age of 11, sitter, had taken these pictures, and I remember looking at my friend and thinking, as kids we didn't know that. But we did know that something had happened to this guy in order for these pictures to be taken. He keeps talking about girls, what he wants to do with them, and it was very strange. And it's what you're saying is sort of ringing true about this.
Right. Absolutely. And that is now one of the reasons why it is so important to talk to our children about not just what their body parts are named, but to talk to them about what is appropriate, who's allowed to see them, without their clothes on, well, mom or dad may be helping them in the bathtub, something like that. But if we're teaching our children from the time they can talk and walk about their private parts and what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, then by the time they're 10 or 11 or 12 and another child does this, that child can go home and tell their parents, say, this is what happened, so that somebody can step in and say, hey, I think this child is being abused.
Yeah.
But without teaching our children that, children aren't going to know this, they're going to have that queasy feeling that they don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
They would know, hey, let me go talk to mom or dad or the teacher or somebody to alert them that this is going on. But unless we teach our children at a young age about these things, they're not going to know what to do with that.
No. Just think there's
I bet you probably didn't know what to do when you saw or heard that. You just kind of felt like this is icky, but what do you do after that? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I wonder if, like, with some parents, they themselves are too sort of embarrassed by the shamefulness of educating such filth.
Oh, they are, absolutely. But as parents, we've got to get over that.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that's how children stay victims. We've got to get out of our comfort zone as parents and realize that as parents, we teach our child not to walk in the street so they don't get hit by a car. But we're afraid to teach our children about their bodies. I mean, that's part of our job.
Yeah.
We've got to learn to step out of our comfort zone. And they make books, you know, that you can start teaching your child at a young age about, you know, their bodies and their private parts and what's appropriate. You don't have to scare your kids.
No.
But you can talk with your kids. You know, if somebody ever shows you something that makes you uncomfortable, come tell us so that we know what's going on.
Yeah.
Go talk to a teacher. Let that teacher know, hey, this happened on recess, and so had pictures, and that made me feel really weird. We need to be teaching our kids it's okay to talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
We want our kids to come and tell them about what their day was at school. Does that only mean about how you did on the math test, or does that mean everything? We've got to leave that door open for children so that they can feel free to talk to them about these types of things.
Mm. Yeah, it's true. Yes, that's true, isn't it? Yeah. It's a shame, isn't it? Yeah.
Go ahead.
The sort of denial, isn't it? That sort of taking no responsibility, and it's just come into my head now, really, that certainly sort of, I don't know, some children of strictly religious parents, maybe they're not taught intimate body parts because, or the facts of life, because of, it's assumed that their purity won't ever involve them, or it won't ever involve them, you know, needing to know.
Oh, definitely. I mean, my mother, of course, you know, as I've talked in my first two interviews, we were a very, very strict religious Pentecostal denomination.
Mm.
And the only things we were ever taught growing up was don't get pregnant before you get married.
Yeah.
That was it. No explanation about how you get pregnant.
Oh,
before
crumbs.
you get married. And no instruction.
Yeah.
No explanation about boys, girls, nothing. Just all we were told was don't you get pregnant before you get married, and if you do, don't come home.
Oh.
Yeah. We were taught that, and when I talked with my mother years later, before she died, and she lived out close to where I live now, and I asked her one day, I said, why didn't you all teach me and my sister both, Jeannie, about getting pregnant?
Yeah.
About our body parts, about any of this? And she said, well, by the time I thought you were old enough to know, you already knew. And I said, well, how old is that? She said 17. And I'm like, even though I wasn't a promiscuous girl by any stretch of the imagination, until I was 15, I thought you could just get pregnant by kissing
Yeah. Yeah.
a guy. That's when I learned in health class that, hey, you know, there's much more of getting pregnant than just kissing. But I mean, and I know it sounds silly, but there's thousands of kids that grew up in the same age that I am who feared they were pregnant because they kissed a boy at school.
Oh, really? Yeah.
That seems laughable, but it's the truth because we weren't taught anything about it. All we were taught was if you get pregnant before you're married, you're going to hell. That's what we were taught. And that's why my dad said, if you get pregnant before you're married, do not come home. I'll disown you. He told my sister that, and he told me that. No explanation about how you get pregnant. Just don't do it.
That's crazy. That's
like saying don't get scalded with hot water, but I'm not going to tell you which one's hot and which one's cold.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's the same analogy and the same frustration because, I mean, there's a lot of kids that ended up in my era that got pregnant.
Yeah.
That really didn't know how they got pregnant because they didn't understand the simple facts of life because we weren't taught that.
No.
We were taught anything about our body was shameful unless we were married. Well, I don't even know what to do with that.
No. It kind of reminds me of, have you seen Carrie, the 76 film Carrie?
Yes.
Where the mother, I think they're Jehovah's Witnesses, aren't they? And the mother says, Carrie's going to the prom, and she's all innocent. She just thinks she's wearing a nice dress. She's going to go with a boy having a date, isn't she? And then the mother says, I can see your dirty pillows. Do you remember that? And then she said, they're breast, mama, and every woman has them. That was my American accent, Nancy. Not as good as yours. But the fact is that Carrie just, she's really quite pure in this, and the mother's got the dirty mind.
And just, and I've always loved that movie, in part because I was raised with a mother who was extremely fanatic in the religious sense. And, I mean, to the extent that we had to memorize a scripture a day, we couldn't go out to play until we could say that scripture was memorized for the day. We had Bible verses we had to learn for our Sunday school class on Saturday before Sunday. We couldn't go out to play before those were done. I mean, we prayed anywhere from a half hour to 45 minutes a night. I mean, I could just go on with the religious training, but it's hard for a child to wrap that around when your mother's also coming in the bed to molest you at night.
Yeah, you can't marry that, can you?
It's just, it's hard to, how is it okay for my dad to get up in front of everybody on Sunday, lead the choir, lead the worship, and yet at night he's beating my mom?
Yeah.
It's hard to wrap, okay, we're supposed to be this great Christian family, but behind closed doors there's a whole nother story.
Yeah. So did you assume that sort of thing was normal for other families in the church? If that was normal for the family? I saw other families who were, I saw one family in particular that were very close friends with my parents who were beating their children. Oh, dear.
Severely, because I was actually over there more than once when it happened. And then years later, after they had left our church for, one of the beatings was so bad he left his 7-year-old son's eye blinded.
Oh!
And after the beating, they left town in the middle of the night because one of the church members did call CPS. And so they went on the run for many years, and I found out fast forward about 8 years later, that he had impregnated his daughter, who was the same age as me, at the age of 15. And she had the baby. And so the churches that I went to, there definitely was a lot of abuse to their children. However, I actually overheard a meeting they had about this situation, and I overheard the pastor saying, well, he pays his tithes, so we just need to let this slide.
Well, that makes it
so
right.
As long as you pay your 10%, it's okay what you do to your kids. We just aren't going to talk about it.
It's just rewriting scripture, isn't it?
It is. It's not even rewriting it. It's just ignoring scripture.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
a lot
spot
of
on.
scriptures that talk about not abusing your children, but we just kind of skip over that. I was always hammered into obey your father and mother without question. I mean, that was hammered in my head, so that nobody talked about the love Christ had for children and how precious he saw us.
Yeah.
I mean, we just weren't taught that. I was 17 before I really went to a church that talked about how much God really loved us. And I was just like, really? Because I was raised with the God that was ready to strike you dead at every little tiny infraction that you did wrong.
Yeah.
So it was quite an eye-opener to learn that, I was really loved by God and that I was considered treasure in his eyes.
Yeah, it's a relief, isn't it, to hear that side of the
Lord. And I think that's what did kind of keep me in church and didn't bullet, because I've had a lot of people say, well, with the way you grew up, how could you still have faith in God?
Mm.
But that's just something that I felt like was always there. I had to learn a lot of the things that I was taught wasn't right.
Yeah.
A lot of the scriptures they took and twisted and used, pulled out one or two scriptures to be able to use that as a way to keep us in line, as my dad would say. And I learned, that some of the scriptures they had taken out of context, really didn't fit the situation. They just used one or two scriptures instead of, the whole chapter.
Yeah.
They did that a lot with, many different things in the churches to keep people in line. And, it's just sad because there was a lot of kids I grew up with who did drop out of church. Not necessarily ones who had been abused, but just found disfavor with the way that we were raised.
Yeah.
That just they couldn't come to terms with the whole, God is just ready to strike you dead at any, little tiny infraction. Well, if that's the way he really thinks about us, well, I'm just not going to go to church anymore.
Yeah.
And so it's sad that kind of upbringing has ruined so many lives because it didn't have to be that way.
No. And the saddest thing of all is that those people would have been deemed as being backsliders, with the...
Oh, yeah, that was a big word in our denomination was backsliders, and they would even have services where they would come and pray over what they called the backsliders.
Oh, dear.
They would come down, lay hands on them, and pray, what they would say, pray them back through.
It's patronising apart from anything else.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's very strange, isn't it, how some Christians feel they have the right to, they give their lives to the Lord purely just to judge others. And we don't want to we could wander into another side of things, but yeah, it's it's all control manipulation.
What they do is they tell, adults as well as young children, what that teaches them is that instead of you living your life for the Lord and making that as good as you can, they feel like we have to do this in order to keep you in line. And that's not what faith in God is supposed to be about.
No.
The church is not supposed to be there to, quote, keep you in line.
Yeah.
They're supposed to enhance your relationship with God, to show you how to have that relationship with God. And instead, they flipped it around to, well, we've got to do this in order to keep all you people in line.
It's very manipulative.
It is very manipulative. And that's why so many people my age, dropped out of church in their early 20s because church was not really a place to go and worship God. It was only a place to go to hear about everything you're doing is wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And they had enough of that. We can get that at home if we have to listen to that. Why do we need to go to church and be told we're doing it wrong there too?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Do you know, I'm thinking of, you're familiar with Pat Benatar? I love Pat Benatar. Big fan of hers. And her and her husband, they recorded a song in 1979 called Hell is for Children. Mm-hmm. And there's a line that says, your daddy's sweet girl, don't tell mummy a thing. Be a good little boy and you'll get a new toy. Tell grandma you fell off the swing. And what I love about it's her and her guitarist husband were part of the group. And they sing this song, they're in their 60s now, but they've sung this song every single gig they've performed since 1979 in honour of abused children everywhere. And because they were horrified in, I think some statistics came out in America that around that time where the amount of child abuse going on was, quite horrific. But it's It's just a horrid thing,
I
isn't
wanted to touch on one thing before we do run out of time, though.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of cover how a child reacts to sudden movement, even as an adult now.
Right.
I still struggle at times when people make quick movements right close to my face.
Oh, yeah.
I have people, would reach out to, maybe hug me, but I didn't realize that's what they were going to do, and I instinctively just ducked.
Yeah.
Or jumped back, startled, because I thought I was going to be hit.
Naturally.
I've had people say, well, what's wrong? I wasn't going to hit you, but when you've been hit or slapped as a child all your life, that's almost an instinctive reaction.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So if you have a child, at school who's, if kids are playing or teachers, reach out, maybe like a child's got something in their hair and you reach over to get it out and they duck, they may be afraid that they're fixing to be hit. I know even as a new married adult, I would go into complete panic mode if my husband and I were in a store and he stepped away for a few minutes to look at something else, and I'd turn around to go find him. I couldn't find him. And I would literally be in tears in the store thinking he had just gone off and abandoned me.
Oh,
that he had left me there.
Yeah.
And it came from the fact that my mother would often be hours late picking me up at school. Even in junior and senior high school, the principal of the office staff would be leaving, and I'd still be sitting on the curb waiting for my mother.
Yeah.
And it would just be 5:30, 6 o'clock, and they'd be like, "Are you okay, Nancy?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, she'll be here eventually." But when you grow up with that, you never know if somebody's going to, pick you back up or show up on time. It leaves you with this feeling that you're going to be abandoned.
Yeah.
So if you have a child who is not being picked up properly, now they would call CPS. Back then they didn't. I mean, they would just leave me sitting there waiting on my mom, and they would leave the parking lot.
Well, thank goodness things are different now. It's just a shame you had to go through that because the world was didn't recognise these things.
My dad went to church one Wednesday night, and we were taught that unless you were truly almost dead, you always showed up at church. And for some reason, my mother was really sick. She couldn't go. And I came out of my class. My dad's not there. I walk around searching for my dad, and pretty sure I noticed all the lights are off. They had locked up the church and left me there.
Oh.
My dad gets home, and my mother says, "Well, where's Nancy?" And he's like, "What do you mean, where's Nancy?" And she said, "She went to church with you." He had to go hunt the pastor down to go back to the church 2 hours later to retrieve me, and I couldn't even get in the church office to call home because they had locked the door.
Oh.
Here I am in a completely dark church by myself at the age of 11 or 12, and I was terrified.
Yeah, I bet.
I mean, it's a lonely place when you're in a large church and it's completely dark inside.
Yeah.
And then, my poor husband would be like, "I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to abandon you."
Oh.
But when this has happened repeatedly as a child, that's your first thought, is that there's something I'm going to say or do that's going to piss this person off, that they're going to leave us.
Yeah.
Because that's the thought process a child goes through. I didn't think, well, my dad just forgot about me. I was thinking, what did I do that was so wrong that he didn't want to take me home? That's where a child minds go to.
Yeah.
They go to, there's something I must have done wrong that person left me.
Mm.
So that can have a profound effect on, as an adult even.
Yes.
Because that has happened to you repeatedly as a child. Excuse me.
Crumbs.
And then one last thing I had down is a child that has multiple UTIs, urinary tract infections, or a child who refuses to go to the bathroom at school.
Oh, okay.
I've had children who absolutely refuse to go to the bathroom at school because they're afraid of being abused because that happens to them at home in the bathroom.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's just one more thing. And again, none of these in itself means a child is being abused. I want to be clear.
Yeah.
But if you've got a child who starts showing multiple things that I've talked about, then that's the time to step in and see if we can figure out what's going on.
Mm.
Because, again, a child's not just probably going to walk up and say, hey, somebody's touching me. A child's going to show most of their what's going on through their behavior. And it's up to us as an adult to look at that and go, something doesn't seem right here.
Yeah.
Talk, you can talk to the child. That's fine. Go to your counselor at school. That's fine. But don't just ignore it.
No.
Because I would, when I was working at CASA and volunteering there, I've worked with something like 60-something kids when I was volunteering at CASA.
Mm.
And I've seen one of the first things that we do with CPS when we have a child that's in CPS custody is get that child into therapy. That's the number one priority that we do.
Right.
And we do that for a reason, because that child needs somebody safe to talk to them.
Yeah.
To find out if something happened, and if so, what that something was. But it's up to the adults to look at a situation and go, I think something's not quite right here.
Mm.
That child has a much better life if they can get therapy and help for the things that have happened when they're 9 or 10 or 6 or 8 than when they're 34 or 44.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so important for adults to step in and make that first call. Because these are children. It shouldn't be their responsibility to find help. It should be the adult's responsibility to keep these children safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Nancey, thank you so much. This is so insightful. It's just in education, informative, and such an eye opener. And really appreciate you coming on and sharing all this with us.
I appreciate you allowing me to come back and talk again. And I hope that
can we?
People can hear this, and they can always respond, once you post it on YouTube. Mm. And I try to respond to every post that anybody sends to me. They can email me. And, I just hope that the more that we talk about this, the more that we're able to help children, because that's my goal. If nothing more comes out of my story than just being able to help somebody not feel alone, or enable somebody to say, hey, I've been seeing that child, and you touched on 3 or 4 things that I'm seeing, and I'm going to act on that.
Yeah.
That makes it worth what I went through. I don't want what I went through to define me, but I do want what I went through to help somebody else.
Wow. How beautifully said, and how gracious. Nancey, you're a star. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you. But we will talk further about, because this is a subject that can go on and on, isn't it? So let's do some more soon. It
could, and I'm sure there's 100 more things I could have talked about, but I thought those were the top ones that I felt we needed to, to kind of go over today.
Yeah, that's been great. It's really good. We will do more soon. Thank you. So you are a star. To the audience, thank you for tuning in, and until next time, much love and God bless.